Okay, so this is section 4.3, and we're going to now learn a new way to solve quadratic equations. So you've solved them by factoring, you've solved them by graphing, you've solved them by square roots. Now we're going to solve them using what's called completing the square. All right, so first thing we're going to talk about before we actually get into completing the square is perfect square trinomials. Perfect square trinomials are trinomials that automatically factor into two binomials, a binomial squared, sorry. So in other words, two binomials that are identical, right? So like if my factors are 2x plus 1 and 2x plus 1, or we can write that 2x plus 1 squared, and you multiply those, you're going to get what's called a perfect square trinomial. And so what you're going to be doing is you're going to be making perfect square trinomials. So right here, x squared plus 8x plus 16 is a perfect square trinomial. Now I'm going to tell you how to identify it. You don't have to memorize that, but it makes some things a little bit easier. When the first term is a perfect square and the last term are perfect squares, if you take square root of the first term, which here would be 1, and square root of the second term, which would be 4, if you multiply those together and then times 2, you should get the middle term. So you see 1 times 4 is 4, and then times 2 is 8. That gives me the middle. All right? Here, same thing. Square root of 1 is 1, square root of 25 is 5, 5 times 1 is 5, times 2 gives me 10. Then that's a perfect square trinomial. And they factor to the binomial squared. Okay? So this is what we want to do. We want to be able to make a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so you're going to do that by using this little formula right here. Okay, so we're going to use this little formula to help us make a perfect square trinomial. So what you're going to do on your first part of your worksheet is you're going to practice finding this number right here that would make this into a perfect square trinomial. Okay, and that's called C. All right, so we're going to say what would we need to do to find, how would we find the number that would make this a perfect square trinomial? All right, so what you do is we're going to follow this right here. You're going to take half of the coefficient of x. In other words, the middle term. We're going to take half of negative 12. That gives me negative 6. Then we're going to take that number we just found and we're going to square it. Now this, I like to say this is our two-step, and I realize that most of the time you'll be able to do this math in your head, but you're going to have some problems that involve fractions, and if you're not practicing these two steps, that's going to become very difficult, whereas if you will practice these, it will be very easy. Okay, so you can make it really easy or you can make it really hard. All right, so this number right here, this 36, this is the number that becomes my constant. Okay, so that's the number that I'm going to put right here. So that makes this a perfect square trinomial. Now it says it's going to also ask you for the factors. Okay, so the second number you get will be the constant that makes the perfect square trinomial. And the first number that we got right here, that's 6, that will help me write my factors. My factors are x minus 6 squared. So these are the factors for x squared minus 12x plus 36. All right, you're going to practice that a little bit, the first part of the worksheet. Now we're going to get into solving by completing the square, and we're going to start off with trinomials that have a leading coefficient of 1. Now I want you to highlight this statement right here. Do not skip steps, and as always, no decimals and no mixed numbers. We're going to deal with the fractions. Okay, so these are the steps we're going to follow. I'm going to read through those first, and then we'll go through the example, okay? We're going to, first of all, let me back up a little bit. When you solved by factoring, the first thing you needed to do was get your equation equal to 0, right? When you solved by graphing, of course, you had it y equals 2, right? When you solved by square roots, you didn't need it equal to 0. You needed to look at that original equation, and you needed to start isolating whatever it was that was being squared. You were keeping stuff on both sides of that equal sign, right? Okay. Now, you want to start off, or it really doesn't matter if you start off with it equal to 0 or not, but what you want to do in the first step is you want to move the constant to the right-hand side. The constant here being negative 40. We want the x squared term and the x term on the left, and we want the constant on the right. So remember, when you move it, it changes the sign. So x squared minus 6x equals 40. Then we're going to find the term that completes the square on the left side of the equal sign. Let's stop for a second. Look at this left-hand side. Do you see that that looks just like this did before we found that constant right there? Yes? Okay. So we're going to take this left-hand side and we're going to turn it into a perfect square trinomial, right? And with whatever number we get that we're going to put there, we have to remember that we have to add that number to both sides of the equation, because right now it's a balanced equation. And you can't change one side without balancing it and changing the other side. So here's our little, and we're going to go off to the side, and we're going to do what I call our little two-step, okay? We're going to take half of the middle term, or the coefficient of x. So half of negative 6 gives me negative 3. And then I'm going to take that number that I just got and square it. Okay, now the second number that I got, that's the one I'm going to use first. Okay, so I'm going to add that number to both sides, and you're going to show me that you are adding it to both sides. Okay, this step right here, guys, this step right here, I do not want you to add those numbers together yet. I want you to show me that you're adding that value to both sides. Okay, don't add them together yet. We'll do that in a second. All right, next, step 3. We're going to factor the perfect square trinomial that we just made on the left, and we will add these values on the right. Okay, now, factor this. That's when I'm going to use this first number that I got. My factor is going to be x minus 3 squared, and we'll add those numbers on the right. Okay, now from here, it's going to be like you did in the problems that you had when you solved by square roots. Okay, you see I've got something squared. Okay, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And when I do, what do you have to remember on the right-hand side? Plus, minus. And I will take off if it does not appear in this step right here. Yeah, you have to have it at the end, but if you don't put it in right here, I'm taking points off of your paper, okay? All right, so plus or minus square root of 49. Okay, so x minus 3 is equal to plus and minus 7. Now, just in your last lesson where we did this, if this number's a perfect square so that the radical goes away, this is where you need to split your work. You split it into two parts. X minus 3 equals 7, and x minus 3 equals negative 7. And if you give me that as your answer, if you write your answer as something like 3 plus or minus 7, that's the one that's going to make me mad, okay? So don't do that. Solve it. X is equal to 10, and x is equal to negative 4. Two separate answers. Okay, any questions on that part? Everybody's all right? Okay, let's go to the next page. We're just going to do the same thing again. Okay, we're going to do two more where the leading coefficient is 1. Same process. First thing I'm going to do is move the constant to the right-hand side. So x squared minus 4x equals positive 14. I'm going to do my little two-step over to the side. Half of negative 4 is negative 2, and negative 2 squared gives me 4. Remember, I used the second number first. I'm going to add the second number to both sides. So x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals 14 plus 4. I want the same thing. I want it written on both sides. Everybody all right? Okay, now I'm going to take this perfect square trinomial and I'm going to factor it. This is where I'm going to use the first number in my little two steps. So my factor is x minus 2 squared, and add the numbers on the right hand side. Now we're going to take the square root of both sides. Square root of x minus 2 squared, and do not forget that plus minus sign. Plus or minus square root of 18. Now 18 is not a perfect square. So if you need to make your factor tree, if you don't need to make it, that's fine. If you do need to make it, remember prime numbers. 2 goes into 18, I get 9, which is 3 times 3. Pair of 3's comes out. So x minus 2 is equal to plus or minus 3 square roots of 2. And now I'm going to finish it off by adding 2, and remember it goes in front of the plus minus sign. So 2 plus or minus 3 square roots of 2. Okay, one more with a leading coefficient of 1. Following those exact same steps, we're going to move the constant to the right-hand side. So x squared plus 6x equals negative 10. Half the middle term. So half of 6 gives me 3, and 3 squared is 9. I used the second number first, adding it to both sides. So x squared plus 6x plus 9 on the left side equals negative 10 plus 9 on the right side. And remember, I want that written out. I want you showing me that you're adding that value to both sides. We'll factor the perfect square trinomial. Here's where you use the first number that you got in your two-step. It's x plus 3 squared equals negative 1. Taking the square root of both sides, so x plus 3 squared equals, once again, remember that plus minus sign, square root of negative 1. So x plus 3 is equal to plus or minus what? I. Square root of negative 1 is I. So plus or minus I. Now we move the 3, so we get x is equal to negative 3 plus or minus I. Alright, so now we're going to get to the problems where the trinomial has a coefficient that is not a 1. Okay, highlight this next statement, okay? When the coefficient of the x squared term is not 1, then you must first divide the entire equation by that coefficient. Okay, so our first step has changed, hasn't it? All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to, since the leading coefficient is 4, we're going to divide every single part of this equation by that leading coefficient. What is that going to do every time? It's going to change my leading coefficient to a 1. You cannot do completing the square if the leading coefficient is not a 1. So So we have to make it a 1. So this is going to give me x squared minus 2x plus 1/4 equals 0. Now notice that that leaves me with a fraction. If it does, it does. And we deal with it. Okay? Don't you dare put a decimal on your paper, because if I see a decimal, I'm putting a red X on that problem and I'm going to the next one. No partial credit. We're dealing with the fraction. Okay? Alright, so same process from here. I'm going to move the constant to the right hand side. So x squared minus 2x equals negative 1/4. And I'm going to do my little two-step thing, okay? So it's going to be half of negative 2 equals negative 1. And negative 1 squared is positive 1. So what number am I adding to both sides? Positive 1, yes? Okay, so x squared minus 2x plus 1. Now I'm going to stop for a second. You see on the right-hand side I have a fraction with a denominator that's 4. What do I have to have when I add fractions? I have to have a common denominator, yes? So instead of saying plus 1, I'm going to say negative 1/4 plus 4/4. Do you understand why I did that? Because I have to add them together. Alright, now on the left, we factor it, and here's where we use that first number. So my factors of my perfect square trinomial are x minus 1 squared, and I add the values on the right hand side, and I get positive 3/4. Is everybody with me? Okay, now we're going to take the square root of both sides. So square root of x minus 1 squared on the left, plus or minus, we're going to use that quotient property. It'll be square root of 3 over square root of 4. So x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus square root of 3 over 2. Since the denominator was a perfect square, when I take the square root of 4, I no longer have a radical in the denominator. So all I have to do is add 1 here. So I get x is equal to 1 plus or minus square root of 3 over 2. Now you cannot leave your answer here. I do not want the answer to be written in 2 parts for you guys. You guys have to write it as 1 part. 1 fraction bar. Do you see what I'm talking about? 2 parts? Okay, so we have to give this a common denominator. X is equal to, it's going to have 1 fraction bar with the denominator 2. Now this is really very simple. You did it before. Okay, so here this is going to be plus or minus square root of 3. And I need the number that divides by 2 that gives me a 1. See, very simple, right? So this is just going to be 2 plus or minus square root of 3 over 2. So you had some practice with that in the earlier lesson. No decimals, no mixed numbers. Any questions? Okay, let's go to the next page. We're going to practice this a couple more times. You'll see something a little different in each one. Now notice that in example 6, the constant is already on the right-hand side. Don't move it to the left and then end up moving it back. Just leave it where it is. It's okay. Just leave it where it is. But I do have a leading coefficient that's not a 1. So I'm still going to divide all of the parts by that leading coefficient. I need the x squared term to be 1x squared. So x squared plus 3x equals negative 2. I don't have any fractions this time, at least not right now, right? Okay, so half my middle term and square it. Half of 3, now I got a fraction, no decimals. Half of 3 is 3 halves. Take that number, 3 halves, and square it. And I get 9/4. Now this is the problem where if you're not doing this, if you're not writing this down, this is going to cause you some problems. Okay? I'll show you what I mean in just a second. Okay, so I'm going to add 9/4 to both sides. X squared plus 3x plus 9/4. And since I'm adding a fraction, I'm going to change -2 to -8/4. Okay, now here, let's say I didn't write this stuff down. I've got to factor x squared plus 3x plus 9/4. Really? Yes, really, you have to factor that. But if you did this two-step that I told you to do, that number right there is the number you need in your factor. It factors to x plus 3/2 squared. And we'll add the numbers on the right, and I get a positive 1/4. Take the square root of both sides. Remembering that plus minus sign, and use the quotient property. This time both the numerator and the denominator are perfect squares. 1 is a perfect square. So x plus 3/2 is equal to plus or minus 1/2. Now what do you do when that is perfect square and this is not a radical anymore? This is where you split it, okay? So we have x plus 3/2 is equal to positive 1/2, and x plus 3/2 is equal to negative 1/2. Add my 3/2, or sorry, subtract 3/2, so I get 1/2 minus 3/2, that's going to give me negative 2/2, which is negative 1. Over here I'm going to subtract 3/2, that's going to give me negative 4/2, which is negative 2. And you can